reasons for signing on to this enterprise, the Bosnian War. You think it couldn't get any more consequential than that? It did. Because then we realized what had happened out of weakness, that we'd allow this to happen. You know, good things happen because people make them happen, and bad things happen because people let them happen. And so a new generation of leaders came in, resolved that when the next challenge occurred to the New World Order, or I would say the New World Disorder, we would not stand idly by, we would take preemptive action. And then, of course, we come to Tony Blair and the war in Iraq and everything else. Now, I did a panorama in '93, which was very controversial, because I wasn't a proper panorama reporter, but I was allowed to say what I thought I could get away with. And it wasn't quite a plea for Western intervention, but it pointed out what the effects of intervention would be and what the effects of non-intervention would be. And I left it at that and let the pictures speak for themselves. But of course, Iraq was different. I mean, we've been faced with this in Libya, we've faced with this in Syria. I've got one of my dodgy poems about this. Iraq, Afghanistan, now Syria too. We learned one lesson and we learned it well. Going the war towards the easy thing to do, but getting out of it is hard as hell. So I've thought this through extensively. I mean, we are talking about the lives of our service people. We're talking about our credibility in the world. We're talking about, you know, whether we care. Does it matter to us? Well, I think it should, but before we commit our armed forces, my view is that 4 conditions have to be met. First of all, the action must be unambiguously legal under the Charter or an authorizing resolution of the United Nations. Secondly, it must be proportionate. And lobbing weapons of shock and awe into a suburb of Baghdad is not proportionate, because a disproportionate number of civilians are going to be killed. Then it has to be doable. And I think this is the problem we have with Afghanistan at the moment. And finally, it has to be sufficiently supported at home. There is no lonelier soldier on the planet than one in an unsupported Europe. And I hang out with the military a lot. I do things for help for heroes, and they are very, very sensitive to this. And the other point I make, and I make it in the introduction, is that journalism itself has changed. There was a sort of golden age, of which I was happy to be part of, which began when the handheld camera came into the war zones. When I started in Vietnam, we were sending black and white film back air freighting. It took 5 days to get there. Now, anything is possible from anywhere, in theory. And it was and of course the great thing was that our editing was moved into the field. So I had a wonderful freedom to do within limits in Bosnia what I wanted. And Mark Damazer, who was then the editor of the 9 o'clock news, said he wished to know more about what I was up to, but since I was facing the bullets and he wasn't, he let me get away with it. And once one of my foreign duty editors said, "What's your report going to be about today, Martin?" And I said, "I think it's going to be about 1 minute and 42 seconds. But then, of course, the mobile phone came into the front line. That's ruining it for all of us. Anyway, I fell into politics. And then the whole thing changed with 9/11. And the reporters are driven back from the front lines unless they're embedded. And if you're embedded, it's a very what you can do is really limited. I mean, you don't see any Afghans now anymore than you saw any Vietnamese in my early reporting in '67. And it's got so dangerous that it's virtually impossible to go, as we now say, unilateral. That is, to report a war on your own without being protected by a military unit. The classic case of what happened to Mary Colvin, this wonderful reporter from the Sunday Times. She was killed 2 months ago in Homs in Syria. There's a man called Stephen Farrell, a New York Times reporter, and this was about 3 years ago in Kabul. A lot of the sensitive stuff goes on when NATO forces may not strike the right targets, and there's a lot of what's called collateral damage or spillage or whatever. And one of the airstrikes went wrong in Kunduz province, and he went out with his interpreter very bravely. He stayed on the ground too long. He was getting the story. He and his interpreter were kidnapped by the Taliban. That night there was an attempt to rescue them in which he got out, the interpreter didn't, and a British soldier was killed as well. So it's almost impossible now to do what we used to do. And I think one of the things that's happened is that you can see it in the way television news has developed. It's not so much of a reporting, but more a performing art. You might wonder why you see all these crisply dressed young men and women waving their arms and walking up and down as they speak. Well, the BBC had a style coach from Iowa teaching them to do this. And it was called Being in the Moment. And I knew that the part had been sold when we had the bankers' crisis, to which I've already referred, and I wanted to see what happened to my pathetic savings. So I switched on what was then called the BBC News Channel, News 24, and there was the presenter standing outside the Bank of England, broad daylight, summertime, 8 o'clock in the morning, a man, and he was wearing lip gloss. I thought, real men don't wear lip gloss. It can't be so. Everything, it's a bit like our politics. It's on sort of superficial and spin and everything. But the issues are actually quite important. And in my book, A Dodgy Poems, I write one about, it's called Hearts and Minds. The operations winning minds and hearts, or so we're told, until the shooting starts, and then the hovering Apaches smother the Taliban or not with cannon fire and bombs and shells and missiles of all kinds under the euphemism of air cover. Collateral damage, once it was called spillage, disintegrates another Afghan village. The casualties, both theirs and ours, rise higher, and all it's ever doing for hearts and minds is blowing them apart from one another. Something that's really been borne in on me, I'd probably go on about it too much, is that I think we've gone AWOL from our history. We British are now fighting our 4th Afghan war. We might like to pause and wonder who won the other 3. We didn't. We got nowhere near it. What we did was, we declared victory and left the field. And the classic here was the 2nd Afghan War, 1878 to 1880, which we got the message after only 2 years. This time it's taken us 10. I'll spare you the history of the 2nd Afghan War, but there was a poet, even dodgier than I, whose name was William Topaz McGonigal. And he specialised in the anthems of imperial expeditions, and there was a hell of a lot going on, and he was flourishing at this time. And so he wrote a poem in honour of General Sir Frederick Roberts, later Lord Roberts, the British commander, also in the Boer War. And I'll spare you, because I'm a merciful man, the first 15 stanzas. But it ends like this. Success to Lord Roberts, a very great man who defeated the Afghans in Afghanistan. With an army of 7,000 strong, he spread death and desolation all along. It's the size of the British Army in Helmand Province. 7,000 strong. Where we were is where we are. And there's not a regiment in the British Army, not one of the old ones like your 2 wonderful ones in Kent, or one of the new amalgamated ones, which doesn't have 2 place names over and over again on its battle honours. They are Afghanistan and Mesopotamia. And where have we been the last 10 years? Afghanistan and Mesopotamia. And I think one of the things that's happened, one of the reasons we've gone AWOL from our history, is because we have a generation of politicians come into office who have no military experience whatever. And this is entirely new. I was told by Lord Carrington, when he was Defence Secretary in Ted Heath's government, must have been about 1971, every single member of Heath's cabinet, with one exception, had served in uniform in the Second World War. The exception was his Education Secretary, Margaret Thatcher, whom it was said she would have made extremely merciless machine gunner. But they knew. Just been to Vietnam. Why did we stay out of Vietnam? I think the answer was Dennis Healy. Still mercifully going strong at 90-something. But he had been a beach master at Anzio in 1944. He knew the reality. And I don't think it's helped